Good morning, everyone. Chapter 16, Lesson 1, and we're going to start the period of the Civil Rights era. And we're going to be talking about an era in American history where we finally begin to see some real change being made at the local, state, and national level regarding civil rights. And so we want to get back into our magic treehouse again. And we ended with President Johnson in 1969 talking about how he was doing things at home. We want to get back in the magic treehouse, and we're going to go back all the way back, for the most part, all the way to the early 1950s with President Eisenhower and the beginning of the civil rights movement. And then we're going to move forward, and we're going to see how that kind of civil rights movement process takes us all the way through the 1960s. So what we need to understand is that this is a long, slow process. This is going to pick up speed with a lot better organization, and that those organizations are going to be able to put pressure on the American government and on society to make real change. So where does this movement of the 50s and 60s come from? We have to understand, we need to remember that there's two types of segregation in America by the 1950s. There's legal segregation, which we've already talked about because the Supreme Court established in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson that laws segregating African Americans were legal under the separate but equal doctrine, right? So we have that court case that says it's legal, Plessy versus Ferguson, and separate but equal is the reasoning for that legality. But there's also something called de facto segregation, which is kind of just accepted as normal. It's just the way it is, even if it's not legally enforced. And no, I'm not saying that this type of segregation is good. I'm not saying that this type of segregation is bad. I'm not making that judgment right now. What I'm saying is that it exists. It's segregation by custom and tradition rather than by law, and that's called de facto segregation. Let me give you an easy example to understand, just taking a look at American neighborhoods. If we take a look at the last 36 years of American neighborhoods, and really even just 30 years if you want to go to like 2010, you can see, for example, right here, that in white neighborhoods, there has barely been any change in the number of African Americans or even really Hispanic Americans living in white neighborhoods, right? It just hasn't been. And if you look at Hispanic neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, whites have been leaving, showing that there's even less segregation in Latino neighborhoods than there might have been in the 1980s. So this is a good example of de facto segregation where you can see that races over even the last 30 years are not living together. They're not living close together at all. So now understand there are some victories against segregation before 1950. We see a whole bunch of them. World War II factories are integrated. The military is integrated in 1948 under Truman. Color barriers broken by Jackie Robinson's. Juries are desegregated in 1935. But the first real push of the civil rights movement against segregation in the North and South is undertaken by a group called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. I just highlighted them on the screen. And what they did is they would use sit-ins as a form of protest to successfully integrate different restaurants and theaters and other public facilities, starting in the North, Chicago, Detroit, Denver, Syracuse, moving south. So for example, here are members of CORE sitting at an all-white lunch counter, and they're being harassed, attacked by others who want them to leave that lunch counter, but they're refusing to do so. And they're attempting to desegregate a restaurant. And they started it in the North because it was safer. Less chance of being lynched in the North. But these sit-ins in these places by CORE, they're going to be the beginning of the movement. It's going to show that it's now organized and it can protest large scale across the country. That organization becomes especially effective when you combine it with a series of court cases that African Americans and other groups brought to the Supreme Court in an attempt to get rid of Plessy versus Ferguson. A great example of this is 1954. Supreme Court decided to hear a case that they called Brown versus the Board of Education. And that's a really, 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 really important court case. Circle it in your notes. It's really important. There was a young girl, and she was just one of a bunch of different court cases like this, named Linda Brown. She was denied access to a white school that was right near her home. And instead, she had to walk blocks and get on a bus and go miles away to an all-black school. And her lawyer was this guy up here in the upper right. I just circled his face. That's his name right there. His name is Thurgood Marshall. That's her lawyer. He later becomes the head of the NAACP, head lawyer of the NAACP. He actually ends up becoming a member of the Supreme Court himself, and he's her lawyer. And he argues that this is effectively not equal, that it's just not equal at all. When we look at the quality of school we're sending kids to, what we see is that they're not equal. They're separate for sure, but they have worse textbooks, worse teachers, worse classrooms, worse facilities, worse equipment. All of it is worse, not equal. And the Supreme Court says you're right. You're right. When it comes to schools, it's pretty clear segregation is unconstitutional. It's separate, but it's not equal. And what happens here is that Southern whites, they're going to start to feel threatened because, oh my God, the foundation of how they have their entire society set up, segregation, is unconstitutional. Like, you need to understand that this is a threat to just how people live their life on a large scale in the South. So you're going to see a whole bunch of Southerners resist the ruling. They're not going to listen. They're going to want to fight this. One of the things that local governments in the South do, they create these new kinds of laws. They call them pupil assignment laws. And that's a fancy way of saying these laws were designed to keep African Americans from attending white school. And so what they would do is they would look at other factors besides race, other than race, like literacy. And so what they'd say is, well, if you want to attend this school over here, you need to be able to read at a 4th grade level. And they would do that knowing full well that African American kids coming from that African American school couldn't read at a 4th grade level. And it would keep them segregated. It was just another way of keeping people out. You changed the topic. You said it was one thing, literacy, but it was really about race. So when these schools and their laws were sued, the Supreme Court said that schools had to desegregate with all deliberate speed. What does that even mean? When the Supreme Court orders schools to end segregation with all deliberate speed, that wording is so vague. Districts are able to keep their schools segregated for years because, I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean that you have to do it speedily or deliberately, which actually kind of means slow, or that you just need to be careful? Like, what does that even mean, all deliberate speed? If you look at a map, this map right here, I'm gonna get rid of this slide. I'll bring it back in a second, don't worry. You look at this map, desegregation over 10 years in the South, 54 to 64. By 1964, 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education says you can't segregate kids, in all of these states, 0 to 1% of African Americans attended schools with whites. 0 to 1%. Essentially 10 years later, 1964, these courts, or these schools I should say, they're still segregated. Only a few states had 20 to 60% of African Americans in school with whites. Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia. Only those closest to the north. So you see, the further south you go, the less desegregation there actually is. And this really makes African Americans upset, as you might think, that the courts say there should be change, but white America refuses to make that change. Black America really becomes frustrated by the slow pace of change. So you're going to see the civil rights movement begin to spread nationwide, starting in 1955 when Rosa Parks provides a spark. She gets on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, Rosa Parks, she's been portrayed as this little old lady who's like, I'm too tired to get up and give away my feet hurt. So not true, so not true. She was a worker for the NAACP. She was critic of segregation. She taught young kids how to resist the system. She outright refused to give up her bus to a white passenger because she was sick and tired of having to move. And in response to this arrest, African Americans organize a bus boycott. And they end up putting carpools together. So you can see, for example, what you would have would be African Americans getting rides from people that would drive around town, helping people get from one place to another. And this boycott of Montgomery buses really helped advance the civil rights movement because it brings to attention just how many things in the South truly are segregated and how arcane those rules are. I mean, really? Black people can't sit where they want on the bus? I mean, come on, man. You're going to see new leaders begin to emerge because of this bus boycott and other things like it, like Martin Luther King Jr. He's a pastor. He's elected to lead boycotters in this crusade for their civil rights. He says, you know what, here's what we need to do. We need to have nonviolent, passive resistance. And that's a powerful tool, protest, a powerful tool to achieve change. And look, he was not advocating violence. He says the weapon that they have is protest. Look, Martin Luther King understands it. Nonviolent, passive resistance, it might provoke violence. It's not the only way to make change, but it's the powerful tool to actually achieve change. Because Dr. King believed that so many people were taught hatred and prejudice when they're kids, so that when you're an adult, there's nothing else but hate in your heart for African Americans. So the only way you can understand this is that white adults aren't totally responsible for the hatred and violence that they feel because they were taught that. So Black America has to teach white America not to hate. And the best way to do that was through tolerance and understanding, love. Use the weapon of love. Realize that so many were taught to hate, they're not responsible for it. Love is the answer, according to Martin Luther King. And like him, tons of leaders of the civil rights movement were ministers in African American churches. In fact, that little passage right there about King using love to combat hatred, that's going to be your short answer question on your exam in a couple of days. Now, I don't want you to think, ladies and gentlemen, that all of a sudden we were going to see the government of America just all of a sudden be all about supporting equal rights for Black Americans. That's not how that necessarily is going to function. In fact, what we're going to see is that that's not the case really at all. President Eisenhower, while he does sympathize with the civil rights movement, he's like, all right, you guys have good points, you want to be treated equally, there's nothing wrong with that, but he doesn't really promote the movement quickly at all because he disagrees with the courts trying to make people change. President Eisenhower says that you can't force people to change their minds by passing laws. You can't legislate people into their changing their opinions. You can't change our hearts with laws or decisions, according to Eisenhower. But what this does do, what passing laws does do, is it forces people to accept change, even if they don't like it. And while that change is controversial for several years, it will slowly lead society to change. So, for example, 2 years or 3 years after schools are ordered to desegregate, there's a crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, because all-white Central High School in Little Rock has to desegregate and admit 9 African-American students. But the governor of the time, this guy right here, a guy named Oral Faubus, he's against racial integration of schools in Little Rock. And he refuses to allow those 9 Black Americans into that school. So he orders the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the 9 students from entering the school. He wants the votes and the support of those segregationist whites. Orville Faubus, when he does this, when he orders the Arkansas National Guard to do this, this is the first time that you've seen the armed forces of a state, in this case Arkansas, to oppose federal governments since the Civil War. This is a state directly telling Washington, D.C. and the Supreme Court, no, we're not doing it. Eisenhower has a choice. He can either let Faubus do this, and you're going to see riots and anger spread to other states and cities, or you can put an end to it, which is what Eisenhower does. He sends the U.S. Army into the South, into Arkansas, to stop the violence. He's the first president since Reconstruction to send federal troops into the South to protect the constitutional rights of African Americans. And this is a big deal because for the first time in a long time, the federal government is willing to put its money where its mouth is and use its troops to force desegregation. That's a really big deal. Now, we'll talk more about all of this: CORE, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Brown v. Board, desegregation, Little Rock Nine, when we get into class a little bit later.